Okay, there's no way that this is gonna work, right? Oh my goodness. Hey guys, this is Patrick from STH, and today we're gonna check out why this might be one of the craziest little boxes and have some uses beyond what other people are even thinking about. Now, over the last year or so, we have been doing a ton of firewall reviews, and something that has been a constant theme has been, number one, people wanna see AMD versions, and number two, people wanna see 10 gigabit Ethernet. Well, unfortunately, this one is not a 10 gigabit Ethernet one. In fact, that is exactly what this is right here. We're gonna get to this one hopefully pretty darn soon. But what this is an AMD Ryzen based one. And it's not like an old, crazy old 2017 Ryzen. Oh no, this is actually a Zen 3 Ryzen 5000 series processor in here. The particular one that we got has an AMD Ryzen 7 5825U. Now, based on all the feedback that we got that people want to see these AMD based versions, we actually used some of the budget that we got. Actually, thank you to all the folks that are now STH members. If you want to join, feel free to down below. That's how we're actually purchasing these. But we actually had this one and I was like, hey, let's go and we'll schedule this one team for December or something like that. And then we started disassembling this the other day, and I will tell you, this thing has so many funky things going on that I said, no, we have to do this earlier. And when I say things are funky, let's just start with the exterior and just to kind of give you an idea. You see all these kind of fins that are here, and you might think, oh, well, obviously that's passively cooled. You might think, oh, they're all the same, right? And the answer is no. This thing doesn't just have one fan, it actually has two fans. Even though it has all these little fins, this thing is mostly cooled by the airflow from the fans. And that is just a small taste of what makes this thing wildly crazy. So before we get too far in this, let's just talk about pricing. Now, these things are available from a number of different vendors like Topton. This one's actually the King Novi, but they're all basically the same CW motherboards and stuff inside. Now, pricing on these changes all the time. It depends on the vendor and whatever coupons are on AliExpress and all that kind of stuff. But this unit right here, we purchased for $555. Now, that sounds expensive, but also remember that we got 16 gigabytes of memory and a 0.5 terabyte SSD in here. So this is pretty much a functional system. It's also being sold as a router, and we're definitely gonna talk about that in a little bit. But with that though, let's get to the hardware and let's go explore the wildly funky world of whatever the heck you would call this thing. Okay, so let's look at the front of the chassis, and we're just gonna go through these features pretty quickly because there's a lot to cover here. So the first feature you're gonna see is that we have the power button. Next, we get USB ports, and we get a total of 5 USB ports. Now there's a Type-C port, 2 USB Type-A, and there are USB 2 ports, and there's 2 USB 3 Type-A ports as well. Now we also get a TF slot, and this really your micro SD card slot here. In the US, you typically see things these days that say micro SD, but a lot of the Chinese market ones will actually have TF. I don't really know why that is. If somebody knows, maybe let us know in the comments, but it's just something that we've definitely seen on a lot of these units, and we've also seen on other units that we've reviewed. Let's get to the back of the unit, and here what we're gonna see is definitely the star of the show. You're gonna see that we have 4 2.5 gig Ethernet ports. Now these are Intel i226V based ports, which is the new 2.5 gig Intel NIC. Something that we just typically see is that a lot of Ryzen based systems get maybe 1 or 2 2.5 gig Ethernet ports, but very rarely do we get this many, and especially in a form factor like this that's really good for things like firewalls. This is built to be a firewall, but I think that there's another feature that we should talk about, at least before we get too far into this, and that is the display output situation. Because what you'll see is that we have a HDMI port, we have a display port, and remember that USB Type-C port there? Well, that's a third display output, and you can actually output 4K video to it. I think it's only 4K 60, but at the same time, the fact that you can actually get 4K video times 3 on a firewall is kind of crazy if you just think about that. Now, before we get inside the system, I do want to just kind of show you guys around, because I mentioned earlier that this is not a passively cooled chassis, and it's definitely not. We're going to see the internals on why there's really no good heat transfer between what's inside of here and the chassis, but you do get this nice ribbed thing. I don't really know why, and then you get the nice fan here. Now, something is kind of weird here is just the fact that this ribbing and the vents and all that kind of stuff don't actually extend all the way around the fan. So you're going to see that the vents kind of stop, and then the fan is still still under there. The diameter of the fan is around here, and I don't really know why. I guess maybe they just kind of found this chassis and that's what they're using. But on the other hand, I kind of wish that you had maybe a little better cooling. We'll see why in a sec. But this top vent is not the only one that's an open vent, because there's vents both on this side as well as the other side. And the purpose of one of these vents is so that the air can actually flow out because you have the heat sink and this is actually your exhaust. So you're gonna get hot exhaust out of the side of this chassis, which is just a little bit different from some of the passively cooled ones we've seen previously. Now our unit has something that's, I guess you could call it special, although I don't know if it's really that special. But what you do get here is we get a second fan on the opposite side of the chassis. The reason that that's important is because you could, in theory, put a SATA hard drive or something like that. There's a little included cable, but the mounting holes are like, they're right here, and you can't really do that inside the case, like put a SATA 2.5-inch drive if you have the fan there. So pretty much for me, it's kind of useless. Okay, with that, I think it's time to switch to the overhead view so I can just kind of bring you into the world of opening this very quickly. Okay, so opening this chassis has a total of 8 screws. We're gonna fast forward just so you don't have to watch that. You will notice that we are using a new screwdriver, which is the LTT Creator Edition. So we actually have the LTT screwdriver that Jake and Linus sent. Pretty cool blue one for STH Blue, so that's kind of awesome. And then we have some of the other ones that you might see behind me over in the next couple shots or so. So thank you to the LTT team for this. This is awesome. Okay, so the way that we finished up our external overview, we're really talking a lot about that fan that's on the bottom that blocks your 2.5-inch drive. That's this fan over here. I definitely think that I would get a system with this fan because it directly cools the main part of the motherboard where you have your SSD and then also your SO DIMMs. Okay, we'll disconnect the fan here, and then I just kind of want to give you guys a little overview of what you see. So the first thing you'll see is that we have like a Ranchina or something SSD. I don't know how to say that. If anybody knows, that'd be cool. But this is a 512 gig NVMe SSD, and this is what we got when we actually purchased the unit. Then there's this here, which is a second NVMe SSD slot. This is totally crazy. We're gonna show you this one in a second because you'll see there's this PCB, and if you're thinking, that looks weird, that's a wise observation, but it gets weirder than that even. The other thing that you'll see here is that we get 2 SO DIMM slots. So I'm gonna take this out, and what you're gonna see is that we have a U-Tiger DIMM. This one is 16 gig and it's also DDR4 3200. But the one weird thing about this is that with these 16 gigs of memory, we only get single channel memory. So what I did to just test the fact that, could you put more in the system, we actually used these over here, which are the G.Skill DDR4 3200 32 gig DIMMs, and we did get 64 gigabytes of memory. Okay, let's start getting into Funky Town and let's go take out this SSD so I can show you what's below it. Okay, now with that SSD removed, you can see something that is absolutely crazy. This is another NVMe SSD, kind of like M.2 slot, but it's on a little like PCB that's like a little H board or something like that. Let me remove that real quick. Okay, and this is what this thing looks like, guys. Like, what in the heck? We have never seen one of these in one of these boxes. So this is definitely something that's a little different here. Okay, so let's talk about the cooler here for a sec. So what you're gonna see is this is the exhaust for the cooler, and we have some fins here. And then there is the blower fan on the inside. I don't know if you're gonna be able to see any of this, but there's a blower fan on the inside between these two. And the reason I didn't wanna take this off right now is I wanna actually show you guys the performance before we wreck what it comes like with the factory. One thing I did look is just to make sure that there was contact between the chip and the little copper plate that attaches to the cooler. And there was. I would say that it's not probably the best. So you may, if you see bad temperatures, you may end up being the the guy that goes out and rethermal paste this, sure. The other thing that we can notice here that's happening on a lot of the CW motherboards with like the Celeron N5105s, for example, is that the NICs, so the Intel i226 NICs are actually on the back of the motherboard. Or maybe that's the top of the motherboard. I don't really know what the direction is, but it's on the opposite side from the NVMe SSD as well as the DIMMs. And if you saw our recent N5105, the i226 version that we just did, the V4 version, you'll notice that there was a cooler and there was some cooling for those NICs. This has the same thing. The only difference is that the cooling block is kind of coming out to the fins over here rather than going and actually touching the case. So you're not kind of getting that passive cooling, which is kind of a bummer that they're not really using this case that much. So one of the funny things about these is that some of these are being sold and saying, hey, there's 2 NVMe SSD slots. There are others that are saying that there are 3. And so as I was looking at this, I saw this little like slot on the side of the motherboard. I was like, what in the heck is that? That looks like an M.2 slot almost. There's no way that could work because you're running into the side of the chassis, right? There's no way that works. So I figured that there was a good chance that if I put an SSD in there, it would probably fry the thing, right? And because I didn't know exactly what the M.2 slot was, I said, okay, well, let me go use a less expensive, so use a Western Digital Blue SSD, and we actually put it in here. Okay, so it's now mounted, and maybe you can see, like, it's not very secure. It would also go way past the case. This is a 80 millimeter SSD, and definitely don't have enough room for that. And if you had a smaller SSD, you'd probably run into their case and you wouldn't be able to secure it anyway. So I don't really know why this is considered another NVMe slot by some vendors, but it is. But if you're wondering, did it work? The answer is actually yes. You can see this on, here's a shot from Windows where I actually just kind of put this in, and you can see on the, partition manager or disk management, you can see this SSD show up. What in the heck? There's a SSD slot that is like this that you have to use when it's open. But of course, the main feature in this system is the AMD Ryzen 7 5825U. Now this is an 8-core 16-thread processor. It's a Zen 3 processor, but you also get the RDNA graphics in there. So get an integrated GPU, which is why we can drive those 3 4K displays. We also get a pretty powerful CPU. This is 8-core 16-thread. That is definitely no slouch Zen 3 chip, right? So let's go, and we're going to talk about performance in a sec, but I also want to just talk about the operating systems, because I think that what can you actually run on this is really important. So first, the unit came with OPNsense pre-installed, but we of course reinstalled it as well just to make sure that it actually worked and it wasn't just kind of a funky version that somebody somewhere put on this thing. So I wanted to just kind of put our own, but we did get a OPNsense 22.7 release in there, and so we're able to go and boot this up as a firewall appliance, and OPNsense works fine. On the pfSense side, as of the time that we're recording this, pfSense 2.7 is still in development, and so pfSense 2.6 does not have the i226 drivers. They only have i225, so you have to either use a development version, which is 2.7, or I think the pfSense Plus now supports it, but that assumes that you would want to be on pfSense Plus and you're not looking for like a free solution. Now, if you want to run this as a virtualization host, we were able to use Proxmox VE and install that, no problem. And this thing has plenty of power. Orders of magnitude more power than you need to be able to push a 2.5 gig network connection. This thing is way, way faster because you have a Zen 3, you have Zen 3 cores, and you have a lot of cores. So I just want to point out the fact that from a system perspective, I think that this is one that if you do want to virtualize your firewall, this is the kind of platform that you might want to do it on, because there is absolutely plenty of performance in these CPUs. But on the other hand, if you can drive 3 4K displays, well, maybe you want to run some other kind of Linux. Maybe you want to run a desktop. Well, we ran Ubuntu 22.04 desktop on this, and of course we were able to go and use that. You may want to play with the i226 and get onto a newer kernel, but at the same time, it booted, no problem. So just kind of saying that you can go and get into a desktop with this. So that's an option if you don't want to run Linux as your hypervisor and you just want to kind of run a desktop. Maybe you want to run VMs on that too. Sure, whatever you want, go for it. But let's face it, if you want to run a desktop, a lot of folks are going to want to run Windows because that's pretty prevalent. So we put Windows 11 Pro on here, and there were only a couple little challenges. The big challenge really was just the fact that this Windows 11 install that we used did not have the Intel i226 drivers in there. And so we had to go download the Intel drivers. And then once we downloaded the drivers, of course, everything worked, no problem. We started seeing links and all that kind of stuff. And so overall, I would say it's not really, it's not a completely just install it and go install, but on the other hand, it is really pretty darn easy to go put Windows on this thing. So with Windows, I just want to show some of the benchmarks, just kind of some stuff that's going on here. So first off, just on the performance of the included NVMe SSD. This is definitely a PCIe Gen 3, not very fast PCIe Gen 3 NVMe SSD. You can definitely get something that's a lot faster. The next thing I want to talk about though is just the performance of this, because there's a number of different modes that you can actually do, and we're just going to use Geekbench, and we're going to have our kind of standard benchmarks. So we ran Geekbench 5 in the initial configuration, and frankly, the performance was pretty poor. I was not really happy with the initial performance. So we did a couple things. The first thing I did was, instead of having the 16 gig UTiger DIMM, instead we put 2 of the G.Skill DDR4 3200 32 gig DIMMs. We actually got a lot more performance. So I think going from single channel memory to dual channel memory, I think that actually had a pretty big impact on performance, and frankly more than I was expecting, but it was pretty darn noticeable. Now, the other thing we did with performance was, now that we had dual channel memory, the question was, well, what if we actually went and increased the TDP of the system, and we said, okay, CPU, you can now run, let's go manually set it to say 25 instead of, I think it's running default at like 15 watts. What if we go to 25 watts? So we did that, and we saw we got a little bit better performance, but it wasn't like crazy better performance. It was, it was pretty muted in terms of the overall benefit that we got. And just kind of quickly, we're going to be showing you here a Geekbench run where we actually have core temp running and also CPU-Z, just so you can kind of see what the temperatures were. We did just briefly touch over 80 degrees Celsius, but most of the time we were in that like 60 to maybe like 70, 75 Celsius range. So the temperatures were not like phenomenal, but they weren't terrible. And overall the performance was pretty consistent. Now, I also just want to quickly point out that we did see a little bit better performance than we saw on both the Ryzen 7 5700U and also 5800U in the Asus and ASRock Tiny systems that we looked at previously. So this was a little bit faster than those desktops. It's also the higher end option. There is a 5800U option, as well as I think there's a 5600U, which is a 6-core 12-thread version. Personally, I think that the 5800U, even though it's only a couple dollars less, I would probably get that instead, because I don't think that the performance that we've seen between the 5800U and 5825U is really kind of worth any extra power or any extra dollars or anything like that. It's just such a small increment. It probably wouldn't be my choice, especially if you're running a firewall. You're probably never going to notice that. Okay. Let's talk about power consumption and noise, because this definitely has fans, and the power consumption is more significant than a lot of the lower power boxes like you can see over there with the, for example, the N5105. This thing has a 8-core 16-thread Ryzen, so of course it's going to use more power. But how much? And the first thing we have to talk about though is the power supply on this. The power supply is a 19 volt, 90 watt power supply. It's also a replacement AC adapter. And the reason that matters is the replacement AC adapter is frankly, we've seen a lot of these that are very poor quality. And so this one, you know, just is what it is. It's what you get for free with this. If you want to get a different power supply, you can in the future, but this is what it comes with. Okay, so let's switch to the overhead view, and I'm just going to explain what we're going to look at here. So we have the replacement AC adapter, we have the system, and then that's hooked into the power meter. And what we want to go look at here is we want to look at this number. This is going to tell us how many watts this is using. Right now, we have it idling on the Windows desktop. So this is Windows 11 Pro desktop. It's just sitting at idle, and you're going to see that we generally have somewhere between maybe 9 to about 10.5 watts. Okay, switching to the main cam, I just want to show you that this is the distance from the microphone, which is a Sennheiser MKH416, to the unit, which is, you know, not that far. Call that about a half meter or so. Now, what we're gonna do is we're gonna run Geekbench, and I just wanna show you what this thing actually does. Now, at idle, when this is perfectly idle in that like 9 to 10 watt range, it is virtually silent. It's definitely a lot less noisy than you're gonna hear like the fans on the lights that we're using here. But when you actually start running workloads on it, the fans definitely spin up, and I wanna show you that and also show you the power consumption. So with that, let's go run Geekbench and see what we get. Okay, here we're running at single thread. You can hear this fan spin up and down. It's definitely audible. Okay, so what you're seeing is that on single thread benchmarks, we're getting into that 30 watt range. And then on the maximum power consumption on multi-thread workloads, we're getting into over 60 watts. And the fan is definitely audible when we're doing both versions, but definitely more so now. So while this is being sold as a firewall, on the other hand, it's definitely a pretty high power firewall. It's also not silent like the fanless units, and it uses 3x the power. It's not silent, and so I just want everybody to know that these things are marketed, and they may look from the pictures like they're going to be very similar to the Pentium or the Celeron units that we've been looking at, but what you're seeing is absolutely not. These things definitely use more power and they're noisier. I will say though, at idle is virtually silent. Something else I just wanted to try real quick was just to see if this USB Type-C port could have another trick other than being a USB port and doing display output. What if you could actually power the unit with that? And so I have this little 150 watt power adapter, and I thought let's go see if we can go and actually power this thing with that. Oh my gosh, it worked. Okay, so just trying this out real quick. What we learned here was that number one, we could actually power this with USB-C. You'll see that we have a USB-C cable. It actually didn't work on the top port. I think maybe that was just drawn too much or something like that. So we had to put it on the second port on this unit. But apparently we did get it, and we got pretty similar idle numbers. We might actually be getting a little bit higher idle numbers using the USB Type-C power adapter with this. So you can do it. You maybe will eat a couple tenths of a watt more in power. And also you have to make sure that you have enough power to be able to power something that can do 60 plus watts. Well, I mean, it came with a Came with a cable, so might blow the thing up. Let's see if it works. Put one side in there. We'll hook the other side up here. Looks like we got power. Means it's booting. Let's see what idle's at. Oh, this is gonna be lower idle, cool. Okay, so this is super interesting. We're just using this. Now this thing is designed actually to be able to do both USB-C as well as be like a travel adapter for laptops and stuff. So it's a 150 watt unit, pretty small. When we look at the idle of this thing, we're under 9 watts now. So we're like 8.8, 8.7 watts. Now it'll come up a little bit from there. But that actually means that this power adapter is more efficient than the replacement AC adapter. So it just kind of shows you that you can get a little bit lower power consumption if you use a different adapter. It's also using less power on the direct DC versus going through the Type-C port. So something there too. Okay, so what did we learn on this thing? This is absolutely a crazy funky system, right? Just to me, a couple key takeaways. Number one, I think processor-wise, I think the 5800U is probably what I would get. I don't think that the upgrade to the 5825U is really worth it, but if you want to, why not? It does seem like we're getting a little bit better performance than we saw on other 5800U boxes, so I would assume that you're getting a little bit more performance in here as well. I think as a just kind of standard firewall, this thing has so much CPU power that is way overmatched for 2.5 gig Ethernet. We could run iPerf 3 through these things, no problem. And you know, if you want to go actually put a lot of firewall rules and stuff like that, you're kind of concerned that the like N5105 doesn't have enough CPU performance. This definitely does, but you do make some trade-offs because one, you have an actively cooled system, not a passively cooled system, which is something that I personally prefer my routers to not have a fan, because if I have a firewall or router or something like that and I stick it somewhere, I probably don't want to see it every day. And if I don't want to see it every day, I don't really know if there's a fan that's going to break. So the fact that this system has 2 fans makes me a little bit nervous that if you're going to go tuck it away, what happens if a fan fails? The other thing that I took away though was that this is being sold as a firewall solution, and it definitely works as that. However, frankly, you can easily go and turn this into a virtualization appliance really easily, right? You can put 2 NVMe SSDs in it, not that third one because that's a little funky, but you can put 2 drives in it. You can put 64 gigs of memory. You have 8 cores, 16 threads. That is a pretty darn good virtualization solution right there. And once you have it virtualized, you can then use the extra ports and do things like have your router or your firewall built into that and then do something else with this. Whether that's you want to run Home Assistant or you want to run another type of just kind of application in this, you totally have the power in this system that you can do that. And by the way, you also have the iGPU that you may want to use at some point as well. But on that iGPU thing, that's kind of the other thing, right? This is being sold as a firewall, and it could definitely be a virtualized firewall too. But on the other hand, this thing could also be a desktop. I mean, this is a little tiny desktop. It's about a little over $500 with 16 gigs of memory, and I would definitely upgrade that to 32. But you know, you get a bare bones unit for a lot less than that, and then go put your own SSDs and your own memory in there. And then you have a system that has 4 2.5 gig Ethernet NICs, the newest Intel Ethernet NICs. You can also get up to the 64 gigs of memory. You can put two drives in there. You can run 4K displays. I wouldn't say that I would really want to game on this if you're only going to have like a 4K 60 hertz display. Even as just like a home theater PC, this is also kind of interesting just from that standpoint as well. But when it comes right down to it, in the world of AliExpress, having a little floopy M.2 SSD that you really couldn't even put there, even though there's a slot, having a little board for another NVMe SSD. I mean, what in the heck is going on? This is so much fun. I hope you guys enjoyed this video because this was so cool that I said, hey, let's go put this one earlier in the schedule. And so let's get this one out. And if you did like this video, well, why don't you give it a like, click subscribe, and turn on those notifications so you can see whenever we come out with great new videos. As always, thanks for watching. Have an awesome day.